Welcome, Esoteric Dubidism here again. Trying to finish up a lot of information here, a lot of stuff. Probably two more of these sessions on the science, and then maybe one or two on world religion, different thoughts of the souls from world religion. So probably two more here on the soul, and two more here on science, and then one or two on world religion views of the soul. And that will be a pretty good overview. There's been quite a few of these, so it's a pretty intense overview. So I guess I'll just get started. Okay, let's test the sound. Probably be a little shorter today than yesterday, but yeah, at least 2 hours because there's a lot to get through. Okay, I thought I'd do a little history of anatomy at the beginning. Kind of interesting. This history of anatomy, related to the soul and consciousness. We're talking mainly about the brain and the brain controlling the body. Consciousness is you could consciously control the body or unconsciously control the body, but a lot of religious definitions of the soul won't necessarily have the soul residing in the head, but will have it delocalized through the whole body or in the blood. So be interesting to look a little bit of anatomy, and we'll look at some historical overview and just another historical overview. Usually helpful to me to have all these different historical overviews and put in perspective the progressions of thoughts and ideas. So early Egyptians, we know had mummification. Organs were removed and placed in jars, and cavities were filled with sawdust-like material. Alexandria, Egypt, you had a lot of study of anatomy from like 300 to 150 BC. And they used to let criminals be dissected. Different thoughts about the afterlife back then, but there was a lot of human dissection back then, which died out in the Middle Ages. So Rome conquers Alexandria in 30 BC. Weren't so intellectual in terms of just those generic studies, and they outlawed anatomic studies in human dissection. So from there comes a weak point in anatomy and medicine. Then you have the famous Galen, who was one of the major works of anatomy used to the modern age in Latin. He'd been trained by the Alexandrian tradition. Because human dissections were outlawed by the Romans, Galen's textbook was largely based on dissections of animals, specifically an ape similar to man, which leads to a lot of the inaccuracies in Galen's work, which we'll see playing out. So, here's the ape that Galen used. You could get original copies. Copies of Galen's original anatomy drawings. I think my father has some. And you see he talks like a spirit and different understandings of four humors. And that remains basically the norm for teaching for 1,300 years, Galen. Dark Age during that period. Scientific writings were destroyed. The amount of knowledge of the ancients is much more than the amount presumably most people in the Dark Ages have. And whatever wisdom they have, it's usually not through scientific experiment, but through properly understanding the ancients. Muslims, obviously, just that we saw in most of science, Golden Age of Islam, preserved the Greek wisdom, translated into Arabic. 1,100 Christian scholars discovered the Arabic translations and began the slow process of translating them into Latin. It takes till the 16th century for all these ancient works to be translated into Latin. So you get the first autopsy, 1286, in reference to a dissection being formed to determine the cause of death, now very commonly used. The rise of medical schools in the 1300s. Anatomic studies are becoming popular. So you have medical schools in Italy. Be interested in the role the Jews played in this, which is also well documented. And they did live dissections. And then you have the sculptures, with the rise of anatomy, the Italian Renaissance, and the art sculpture. Leonardo da Vinci, his anatomical proportions are extremely accurate. The Last Supper, the different art techniques related to being able to, at that point there wasn't the printing press, and so artists related to anatomy. Leonardo has many anatomical drawings, if anyone's looked into it. Then Andreas Vesalius, the man who revolutionized anatomy. And, so he had students. At that point, you used to have what we call like a barber, a cheaply paid staff that did the dissections, and the doctor just told them what to do. And so Vesalius said the medical students need to do it themselves. And he saw that Galen's anatomical drawings were inaccurate and needed to be replaced. So he gets rid of barbers, has the doctor do the dissections himself, students actually assisting, and he makes his own anatomy textbook that corrects many of the mistakes in Galen. See some of the drawings. His concept of killing sacred cows, challenging accepted authority for the purpose of improving it. Not sure if it's related to Hinduism or the Bible, but because of his revolutionary work at the University of Padua, Andreas Vesalius is considered to be the father of modern anatomy. And Fabricius, he replaced Vesalius, and he discovers veins. He calls them little doors. You have blood movement. Then you have William Harvey, student of Fabricius, becomes interested in the circulation of blood. Harvey is the first person to describe the heart as a pump for blood, and he also describes arteries and veins as blood vessels that carry blood throughout the body. And Harvey, like Aristotle, function can be inferred from structure, and William Harvey is considered the father of physiology from his student of Vesalius, the father of anatomy. And Marcello Malfighi, discovered that the microscope, Italian anatomist Marcello Malfighi is able to see tiny blood vessels that Harvey could not see but had predicted their presence. And these are called capillaries, like hair-like. Okay, so it's a pretty quick overview of the history of science. I got another history of anatomy. This one kind of goes into the classification, showing like, here's the Homo sapiens, the human beings, and the kingdom, phylum, subphylum, class, order, family, genus, species. You're looking at comparative animal anatomy. And for the discussion of the soul and consciousness, it's a pretty important question of what conscious level does animals have. So, just basic review, the 6 kingdoms. The animal kingdom could go from simple single-cell organisms to complex things like humans. So phylogeny, the study of phyla, ontogeny, the study of individual development, embryology, the study of prenatal development. And so chordata, which is the second order under animal, and animals that have this nerve structure of a chordata, notochord. You can see a little overview of this generic anatomical nerve structure that's common among many animals. You got two-dimensional symmetry, different cavities, dorsal, cranial, vertebrate, different cavities that can contain different organs. And review of basic anatomy, it's probably worthwhile. You could spend unlimited amount of times. I've taken many courses on anatomy. But it was included in the slideshow, so I thought I'd show it. So, relatively good information. What's a mammal? Primates, Homo sapiens. Full use. So, history anatomy. So, the famous Hippocrates, Greek physician, father of medicine, the Hippocratic Oath still used till today, held by the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, attributed disease to natural causes, empirical research. It's the Grecian period. Aristotle, zoologist, a great classifier, wrote the first ever account of embryology, heart development, named the aorta, and differentiated arteries from veins. But he held that the heart, not the brain, was the seat of intelligence. Grecian period, Herophilius, great anatomy teacher in Alexandria that we saw in the last slideshow, dissections of living humans. Crazy. They dissected like live humans back then. And of dead bodies. He regarded the brain as the seat of intelligence. He described the cerebrum, cerebellum, fourth ventricle, tried to identify nerves as sensory or motor, and credited with the discovery of the ovum. And then obviously the Roman period with Galen again, most famous physician since Hippocrates, so-called the Prince of Physicians, most influential writer on medical subjects, possibly ever till today, theorized on many medical subjects like anatomy, physiology, pathology, symptomology, and treatment, identified bloods and arteries containing blood. 1,500 years, his writings were unquestionable, studied the functions of the kidney, spinal cord, a lot of accomplishments. Medieval period again. Anatomy becomes stagnant, flourishes in the Islamic world. Arabs had Galen in high regards. Galen's already translated very early into Arabic, and a lot of advancements made in that area in the Islamic period that later come over to Europe. Renaissance, rebirth of science. Canon remained in the textbook with Galen largely to get Leonardo da Vinci. Painter, sculptor, architect, musician, anatomist, engineer. Observed dissections of cadavers, anatomical sketches, over 500 of them. Originator of cross-sectional anatomy. First to describe moderate band of right ventricle. Then Vesalius again, born in Brussels originally, professor of anatomy at the University of Padua in Italy. 7 works on the human corpus, on the human body. Revolutionized the teaching of anatomy, challenged hundreds of Galen's erroneous concepts, and chose to not have his name attached to the parts of the body he described. William Harvey, student of the student, English anatomist, conducted experiments on the motion of the heart and blood in animals, suggested continuous circulation of the blood within vessels, demonstrated that blood circulates and does not flow back and forth through the same vessels, credit for providing physiologically functional orientation to anatomy. And then Leeuwenhoek, the improvements in the microscope, development of techniques for examining tissue, description of blood cells, spermazoa, skeletal muscle. Malfig, the Italian anatomist, father of histography. Names associated with the Malpighian corpuscles of the kidney and the Malpighian bodies of the spleen. And Hunter, surgeon, developed Hunterian museums in London and Glasgow. Names associated with Hunter's Canal, adductor canal. Conrad von Wentingen first used X-rays to detect bone fractures and assess extent of tuberculosis. Gregor Mendel, hybridization, genetics, de Graaf, described ovaries. Spallanzani showed sperm and ovum. Francis Gleason described liver, gallbladder, stomach, intestine. Thomas Willis published Summary of Nervous System in the 17th and 18th century. 19th century, Hooke coins the term cell. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck observed gel-like substances within the cell. Schleiden and Schwann put forth the cell theory. Rudolf Virchow worked on a book titled Cell Pathology. Johannes Müller applied physics, chemistry, and psychology to the study of the human body. And Antimus Cooper, Cuvier, Meckel, Henry Gray publishes Gray's Anatomy, Descriptive and Surgical. dies at 34. 20th century, ultrasound, CAT scans, MRI, PET. A little side view for what was happening in India, ancient India, Upanishad period, considered golden age of Indian medicine, Ayurveda, the science of life, long life, Veda science, and great proponents, Susruta and Charaka. Susruta lived 2 centuries before Christ and was a contemporary of Charak's guru Atreya. First written evidence Ayurveda is in the Sanskrit writing of Charak Samhita and Sasra Samhita. So Charak Samhita can be dated to about 1 AD. Both of these Samhitas devote a complete section to the subject of anatomy. Besides gross anatomy, embryology, and histology are also talked about. So Susrata or Susruta, 6th century BC, renowned surgeon of ancient India, describes about 120 surgical instruments, 300 surgical procedures, and classifies human surgery into 8 categories. Lived and taught his art on the bank of the Ganga in Varanasi, known as the father of surgery. Anatomical fact described him are 300 bones, 500 muscles. Describes blood vessels, organs like the lung. In the modern period in India, revived by the arrival of the British. Medical schools are established late 19th century, Madras, Calcutta, and Bombay. Got Mortimer's manual, precedes Cunningham's manual of practical anatomy. So, nice quick overview. Do one more on the short history of the evolution of surgery. So, Queen Victoria's surgeon, Sir John Ericsson, the abdomen, chest, and brain will forever be shut from the intrusion of the wise and human surgeon. 2006, today in America, there's over 80,000 operations each day, many including abdomen, chest, and brain. They got epochs of surgery. Historical type surgeries, bandages, dressing, circumcision, opening abscesses, fractures, dislocations, hemorrhoids, amputations, tooth extractions, herniatomies. Hippocrates, medicine and surgery, one discipline, great attention to observation, detail, record keeping, gathering knowledge about diseases, cleanliness, order, practice. So the ancient textbooks, you got the Ayurveda of India, Kota Hammurabi, Alexandria, we've talked about the Roman Empire, Celsus, in the Arabic period, Avicenna. Medieval medicine, mostly religious, dogmatic, low social status of surgeons, surgery practiced by barber surgeons, ban on autopsy, absence of anatomical knowledge, miracles made by saints, illnesses a retribution from heaven, hospitals maintained by the church, sick taken care of by nuns. You got the Salerno School, first school of formal training, commenced in the 12th century, southern Italy, first secular medical school, revival of ancient knowledge, dissection of pigs, emphasis on surgery, recording own experience of surgeon Roger Salerno, Righeria, first independent surgical work in the West. School moves to Bologna after his death. Middle Ages, you get Lefranc in France. Pope Sixtus approves autopsies, stimulation of studies. Leonardo da Vinci, Jacob Silvius, Andreas Berzelius, Paracelsus. Internal medicine and surgery must not be separated. Ambroise Paré, 1510 to 90, apprentice of Vesalius, field surgeon in the French army, performed autopsies, used turpentine instead of burning oil to treat gunshot wounds, amputated limbs, routine ligature of vessels, invented new instruments, limb prosthesis. Enlightenment, revival of medical knowledge, William and John Hunter, better anatomy. Beginning of modern surgery, introduction of anesthesia, be directly related to consciousness, Morton. 1842, tooth extraction under either narcosis in New York, and jaw tumor removal under either narcosis performed by Morton. 1846, first dean at Harvard. Development of biomedical sciences, Edward Jenner, the surgeon, the vaccination, Theodore Schwann, cells, Rudolf Virchow, cellular pathology, François Megandy, nervous system anatomy, Claude Bernard, experimental physiology, homeostasis. Antisepsis, the sepsis phase, Louis Pasteur, correlated between rotting and oxygen content in the air, discoverer of bacteria, Joseph Lister, carbolic acid used for sanitation and Carlisle wound toilet, and operating instruments, death rate drops to 1/3. They use lead and zinc plates to cover wounds. Semmelweis, hydrochloric acid for decontamination of hand after autopsies. Coke, anthrax, sterilization. Schimmelbusch, steam sterilization. Sterile, rubber gloves, further by Halstead. Face masks by Hunter. First Nobel Prize in Medicine, Theodore Kocher. Bern, work in physiology, pathology, and surgery on the thyroid gland. So modern surgery, high degree of specialization, maximum use of related sciences, fast and wide share of information, research-oriented development of surgery guided by the rules of science and law and grants. Independent disciplines sprouting from general surgery, urology, orthopedics, radiology, traumatology, chest surgery, heart surgery, pediatric surgery, hand surgery, vascular surgery, transplantation surgery, neurosurgery, head and neck surgery, ophthalmic surgery, plastic surgery. So the cooperation between disciplines of clinical science and theoretical science. And here's some historical moments of the University of Debrecen, Calvinist College, 1841. 1750, natural sciences in the curricula. 1906, law, science, and medical faculties. 1921, inauguration of the medical faculty. 51, university becomes independent. It's 1977, dentistry faculty. And to what modern surgery looks like today. Okay, thanks for coming. A lot of information here. Trying to make this interesting. I'm losing a little bit of steam, but I'm on the wrap up of all this research, and I think it's going to pay off. At least, hopefully, it'll be beneficial to some people, and they've enjoyed me putting these out there publicly. So now I'm going to move into linguistics. Linguistics will prove probably to be the most important of the brain sciences in terms of understanding brain thought operations. And although there's thought into mathematics, music, almost all forms of brain activity, linguistics is one of the most common popular fields in conscious studies. So the nature of language universals. Greenberg, founding father of the modern typology, included language universals. The Dobbs-Sperry Conference on Language Universals, Greenberg's seminal talk on word order, some universals of grammar with particular reference to the order of meaningful elements. Jacobson, Osgood, Hackett, Ferguson. So universals, statements that are true of all or most known human languages. All language has vowels differing in height, distribution patterns, and tendencies. Most languages belong to either the SOV, subject, object, verb, SVO, or VSO, verb, subject, object type. Types of implications on conditions. If a language has adjectives for shape, it also has adjectives for color and size. Absolute rules. Statistical. Consistent verb objects tend to be inflectional. Consistent object verbs tend to be agglutinative. So, overview of different studies. Bidirectional. Language with more than one lateral If they contrast in manner, then they do not contrast in voice. If they contrast in voice, then they do not contrast in manner. In unidirectional, if the language has a dedicated elative, it also has a dedicated elative, but not vice versa. So according to Christoffel, there's three types of universals: universal of language proper, functional principles, universals of conceptual space, discourse, motivations, inventory. So iconicity, semiotic principle, corresponds between the structure of linguistics expression and the conceptual situations they encode. Fundamental principles pertaining to languages, so you have markedness, and conceptual situations that are less frequent are associated with zero marking, then the more frequent situations will also be. Processing ease, accessibility, hierarchy, and relativization. So functional principles are either diachronic or synchronic. Functional principles motivate the creation of novel constructions, but play no role in the propagation of these constructions, nor in a speaker's acquisition and use of existing constructions. Speakers produce existing constructions because they hear them from other speakers, not because the functional principles underlying those constructions. As a result, particular constructions may be maintained in a language because they are conventional, even when the functional motivation underlying them is ceased to hold for the language. Not all constructions of a language may be functionally motivated at the synchronic level. So universal conception of space, basic meaning, motion, space-time, semantic maps, universal relations, similarity of meanings in speaker's mind, manifested in extracted form patterns of combining different meanings, function. Example of a semantic map, this Haspelmath's and Narug's semantic map. Into a modern probability semantic mapping of possible word choices that people might go through. So universal parameters of discourse organization tools each language has to apply, reference identity, tracking, topic focus, the idea grammaticalization of discourse strategies. So universal grammar is only interested in universals proper, not in functional principles or conceptual space, as where language theory is interested in all of those. So here, diachronic versus or synchronic. Read that before. Nature of universals, 2010. Universals proper, part of the speaker's linguistic knowledge. Traditional linguistic typology, until some point indifferent to the issue. Generative grammar. Universals of grammar must be part of the speaker's innate linguistic knowledge to make up for the poverty of external stimulus. So universals, various types of universals are treated differently. Unconditioned universals, implicational universals as parameter settings in principle and parameter theories, including two-way implications, determining parameter clustering by a common parameter, nouns, genitive, and prepositional, one-way implications, hierarchy of parameter settings. So how is this issue related to the founding principle of universal grammar? The implication relationships between the setting of the various parameters limit the number of decisions a language learner has to make, and Baker's prediction is that the fewer such decisions, the more frequent the language type will be. Major problem that the universal grammar approach to the universal spaces is that there are no or very few exceptionless universals. The language universals seem to be statistical by their nature. No obvious way to solve this with principles and parameters approach to the language universals. It is not an acute problem of typology because it can live with statistical tendencies instead of exceptionless generalizations, but it is a challenge. So the linguistic typologicals answer: removing language universal outside speakers' individual grammar, placing them in diachrony instead of synchrony, dynamization of typology, model of competing motivations. Universals result from more or less strong tendency in language change, not from head internal constraints of linguistic parameters. So nice overview of language theory. I'm going on this, a lot to cover. So let's look at language acquisition. The debate about reality. Core problem, is there an objective reality, or do we make our own actual world after our own experiences and or distinctions? Transfer to the question of language acquisition. Language is a thing innate by birth and thus objective. A child uncovers it over time in whatever way. Language is acquired by a child via hearing and imitating the language around. Chomsky's universal grammar. All particular grammars are property of universal grammar. Universal grammar is located in the language facility. The uncovering of particular grammar is totally independent of intelligence, logic, or reason. So why? Why universal grammar? So inadequacy of input, poverty of stimulus. We all learn the same concepts, similarity between languages, logical problem of language acquisition. So parameter and principles. Principles, hardwired layers of universal grammar. Parameters, partially wired modular layers of universal grammar, the modules of which are fixed by experience, a huge leap towards empiricism. Subjections to universal grammar, computer model of the mind, Steinberg, 93, universal grammar seems to simply serve as a filing cabinet for problems which are filed away for later consideration and then forgotten. Although Chomsky himself describes universal grammar as just a heuristic. So empiricism, learning language via general cognition intelligence, language, and intellect develop side by side. Language is a tool for achieving aims. Similar needs lead to similar grammar. Children are social beings. Subjections against empiricism, expressing similar needs does not require similar structure of speech. The conclusion, neither empiricists nor rationalists can explain language acquisition without problems. There must be a disposition to learn language, but whether it's empirical or realist is unanswerable so far. Okay, more on Chomsky. So Darwin, language certainly is not a true instinct, for every language has to be learnt. However, man has an instinctive tendency to speak. Meaning, man has been evolutionarily designed to be able to speak, but without being exposed to language, we will not just begin to use the language. Basic anatomy of the vocal tract, navel cavity, oral cavity, lips, tongue, alveolar ridge, palate, velum, uvula, pharynx, larynx, glottis. Compare chimpanzee to man. Very similar. So before Chomsky, language was thought to be learned through things like conditioning or generalization. It would explain why some children have grown up without contact with language did not acquire the ability to use language. Problems, reinforcement. Most parents do not correct ungrammatical usage, but correct when the information is not correct. Parents' verbal reinforcement is based on the truth value, not grammaticality. In imitation, children do not hear phrase they produce. So Chomsky noticed, even though each language has a finite number of words, there is an infinite number of novel sentences that a person can say that others in the language understood. And therefore, he thought they must be using some sort of generative grammar. And a generative grammar is an unexpressed understanding of a language that has established rules that specify all grammatically correct sentences, even though there are infinite number of possible sentences. And so why language not something you just learn? Children able to produce and understand sentences they never heard before. Children able to do this despite their poverty of input, poverty input, lack of experience with the language. These two things led Chomsky to believe that the language is more instinct than a learned behavior. But how could there be universal when there's so many different languages? So Chomsky proposed the theory of a universal grammar, a basic set of rules that state the range of possibility of grammars for all possible human language, determines the class of human language that can be acquired unconsciously without instruction in the early years of life. Thus, with universal grammar and the predisposition to apply them to the language being heard, children can overcome the poverty of the input. Two basic tasks to learning a language: acquiring a vocabulary of words that stand For concepts, most of the vocabulary is arbitrary, linked to the object they're referring to. Arbitrary, no physical connection between the sound and the meaning of the entities. Acquiring the rules for arranging sequences of words, grammatical rules. Children are very good at this, but they do fall prey to some things like generalization. So is universal grammar really at hand? Chomsky's response: super rules, a consistency in word order that forms part of a child's innate universal grammar. One of the first stages would be for the brain to determine if the language to be used is more word ordered or inflection based. Once that has been determined, then a new set of switch will appear and need to be flipped into any on or off position. There's evidence that grammatical rules are under genetic control. Possibly. Gene familia dysphagia, difficulties with the rules for changing tense and performing plurals. Studied 16 family members that were spread over 3 generations. Family members also had difficulties with detecting grammatical errors in both speech and writing. Critical age hypothesis: the ability to learn a native language developed with a fixed period from birth to puberty. During this time, learning is easy and does not require much instruction. After this period, a lot more instruction is required, and mastery of the language is never fully achieved. So what happens when a child is not exposed to a language? That the kids grow up with wolves, or a kid kept in a small room till 14 years of age, didn't speak or know any language, unable to language even with linguistic teaching, learned large vocabulary, but syntax and morphology never fully developed. Syntax, the rules for formation of grammatical sentence in a language. Morphology is the pattern of word formation in a particular language. Then you have Chelsea, that had been hard of hearing but was diagnosed as retarded, didn't learn language till 31. They have these concepts of pidgin, the result of immigration of people from any location. Pidgin's a simplified or broken form of language, varies from speaker to speaker and from location to location, lacks vocabulary, syntax, articles, conjunctions, prepositions, tenses, and auxiliary verbs. Still more complex than imagined, still rule govern. Word order is typically reflected by the rules of the person's first language, used to communicate to others who did not speak the language, the same language, like for trading, created by adults who only spoke and only spoken as a second language. So pidgin in children, called Creole, language often spoken when children are raised in a polyglot community where pidgin is the only common language between members. When pidgin is adopted as the native tongue and used by the child as the first language, more consistent from speaker to speaker, has larger vocabulary, regular word order and syntax, and is only a little less complex than a typical language. So Creole, Brickerton argues that the grammar used in Creole is the result of the innate linguistic abilities of children. Because Creole begins with children, and because there are too many differences between Creole and other possible language donors. Is Bickerton right? Studies comparing Creole languages from around the world show that there are more similarities between each Creole language than any other language. Bickerton concludes drivers from the structure of a species-specific program for language, genetically coded and expressed in the structure and modes of operation of the human brain. So differences: universal grammar suggests that there is a mechanism that flips switches or to engage or disengage rules appropriate for the language being learned. Species-specific program of language would be the grammatical structure before any switches are flipped. Children do not grow up speaking Creole because they have to make changes to fit the linguistic input. When children make mistakes in their language, it is often mistakes consistent with Creole language. Okay. So let's look at linguistic theory. How do we explain things? Science, we want to ask, why? Reductionist problem: if X explains Y, what explains X? The only natural end to this would be to map everything back to the initial event, but we can't do this, not enough evidence. Even if we could, we wouldn't understand, and what's the point of an explanation you can't understand? So in linguistics, there are 2 ways that explanation comes into linguistics. The normal one, what explains it? And a more technical one, given 2 theories, how do we decide which one is the best? The levels of adequacy: for any set of data, there are infinite possible grammars that capture the data. So how do we decide which one is the right one? So a demonstration of infinite possible grammars. And, so just one letter, and you could see you could infinitely arrange that, since there's infinite possibility of grammars, even for a language that only has one word with one letter. So all these grammars are distinct, but they also generate languages which sentences made up of any number. So which one's correct? Chomsky proposed that different grammars attain different levels of adequacy: observational adequacy, descriptive adequacy, and explanatory adequacy. Explanatory adequacy is the highest. Observational adequacy is a grammar which predicts all and only the grammatical sentences of a language. All the grammars were previewed. Descriptive adequacy: native speakers have intuitions about how sentences are structured. A grammar which conforms to these intuitions is descriptively adequate. And explanatory adequacy, a theory which sheds light on the logical problem of language acquisition, is explanatorily adequate. Two descriptively adequate theories of two different languages do not amount to an explanatory adequate theory of language if they are very disparate. If both are possible human grammars, how would a child be able to learn any one? A theory which contributes to a coherent notion of universal grammar thereby is one which has explanatory adequacy. The normal explanation adequacy does not itself guarantee explanation. It is just a method to use to distinguish between different grammars and guide research. Explanation in linguistics comes through restriction. Grammatical principles are as complex as the data, then we have description. The simpler the grammar, the more explanation. Simple does not necessarily mean easy to understand. It means structurally simpler. The fewer and more general the principles, the simpler. Suppose we have a grammar whose principles are in one-to-one relation with linguistic phenomenon. Here the grammar is just as complex as the data, and it doesn't help us understand it any better. But if two or more of these principles can be collapsed into a more general one, the grammar is simpler than the data. This is the reductionist argument, and we may be able to achieve more and more explanation, but we can never achieve the ultimate explanation. So you got the minimalist program. Chomsky argued since the 90s that we can achieve a greater degree of explanation if the theory we produce is built on only absolutely necessary assumptions. Then it cannot be reduced any further. So what's absolutely necessary? The set of assumptions that if they were not made, we wouldn't have a theory of language. Suppose language is the mental system that links the part of the mind concerned with thinking and the part of the mind concerned with articulation, thought and action. Two interfaces have requirements for language. In order for it to do its job, the products of the linguistic system must be interpretable in the relevant ways. Suppose that is all there is. The linguistic component consists of only the things that are required to enable interpretation by the conceptual and phonetic component. If anything else is needed to account for linguistic phenomenon, this will require explanation, and we're back to where we started. So the minimalist demonstration: why do things move? Language shows a number of phenomena which involve semantically interpretable features coupled with similar features which are not interpreted, like verb agreement. Features are interpretable on the subject, person, number, gender. Features are purely grammatical, uninterpretable on the verb. Presumably, uninterpretable features are a problem at the output. What would the conceptual and phonetic components do with them? So the minimalist claim is that the movement serves the purpose of checking off uninterpretable features. Uninterpretable features are generated in some position. The verb moves to be in a certain structure relation with the subject, specifier head, where the features of one are checked against those of the other. The features do not check, they remain and cause the structure to be uninterpretable. So phase structure in the minimalist program: the output systems require a single structure to be formed from individual words and interpretations. How can a sentence be interpreted either semantically or phonetically if unconnected words are presented? So it's necessary to have a structure building part of the grammar. So, nice little overviews. I got one more. I'm going to read an article about baby speaking, semantics. So here's interesting. From the ethnological perspective, perhaps the most astounding fact is that 80% of all Homo sapiens cannot understand these simple utterances at all, whereas the individual of all non-human species can communicate effectively With all of their conspecifics, human beings can communicate effectively only with other persons who have grown up in their same linguistic community. Whatever may be the reasons for this unique, indeed bizarre situation, one immediate outcome is that, unlike most other animal species, human beings cannot be born with any specific set of communicative behaviors. Young children must learn the set of linguistic conventions used by those around them, which for any given language consist of tens of thousands and perhaps even hundreds of thousands of individual words, expressions, and constructions. There's flexibility. Human species is biologically prepared for this prodigious task in ways that individuals of other species are not. But this preparation cannot be too specific, as human children must be flexible enough to learn not only all the different words and conventional expressions, but also all the different types of abstract constructional patterns that these languages have grammaticized historically. It takes many years of daily interaction with mature language users for children to attain adult-like skills, longer period of learning with more things to be learned by many orders of magnitude than is required of any other species on the planet. So the innateness hypothesis. Our ability to speak and understand a natural language results from and is made possible by richly structured and biologically determined capacities specific both to our species and to this domain. The language faculty is part of the human biology, tied up with the architecture of the human brain, and distinct in part from others. The language organ, the path of development which we observe suggests that the growth of the language results from a specific innate capacity rather than emerging on purely inductive basis from observation of the language around us. The mature system incorporates properties that could not have been learned from observation or any plausible available combination. So arguments for the innate hypothesis: speed of acquisition. Language is acquired in a remarkably short period, which would not be possible if humans did not have an innate language faculty. Poverty of data. The grammar acquired by children is much more complex than one should expect of the basis of the language data the children is exposed to from people around them. In language universals, language resemble each other in structural features that are not necessarily properties of the language. Arguments against innateness. So speed of acquisition. In order to assess this argument, we need to know what it means to acquire language in a remarkably short period, and this information has never been supplied. Poverty of data. The statement about the poverty of data, which was done years before anyone did serious research on the nature and the speed addressed to children, has not been supported by later research. Language universals. The number of language universals is not that impressive and not large enough to justify the postulation of innate language faculty. More arguments: speed of acquisition. More arguments against innateness. So speed of acquisition, it thus takes many years of daily interaction with mature language users for children to attain adult-like skills. This is a longer period of learning with more things to be learned by many orders of magnitude. This is required of any other species on the planet. Poverty of data. The principles and structures who exist in it itself difficult to explain without universal grammar. Our theory internal affairs and simply do not exist in usage-based theories of language. Universal.
Who would you like to FaceTime with?
Language universals. Virtually all linguists involved in the detailed analysis of individual languages cross-linguistically agree that there are very few specific grammatical categories and constructions present in all languages. The language universals, obviously, it's just that they're not universal of form, not particular kind of linguistic symbols or grammatical categories or synthetic constructions, but rather universals of communication and cognition and human physiology. Because all languages are used by human beings with similar social lives, all peoples have the need to solve in their languages certain kinds of communication tasks. The cognitive functionalist linguists. So a little overview. Hope people could look at these. You got Joan Bybee, who wrote Morphology, a study of the relationship between meaning and form. University of Oslo. Ronald Langaker, Foundations of Cognitive Grammar. I think I have that book. George Lakoff, Moral Politics, How Liberals and Conservatives Think. Philosophy of Flesh, the Embodied Mind, is challenge to the Western tradition. Leonard Talmy, professor of linguistics, University of Buffalo, toward cognitive semantics, confines the field of linguistic semantics, approach to the question of how language organized is conceptual material, both at a general level and by analyzing a crucial set of particular conceptual domains, space and time, motion and location, causation, force and interaction, and attention and viewpoint. Talmy maintains that these are among the most fundamental parameters by which language structures conception. Adela Goldberg, Princeton University. Argument structure, constructions, constructor, grammar approach to argument structure, constructions at work, the nature of generalization in language. William Croft, New Mexico, cognitive linguistics, radical construction grammar, syntactic theory and typological perspective, explaining language change, typology, and universals. So cognitive functional linguistics, you have cognitive commitment, generalization commitment, functionalist commitment, and the embodied mind. The cognitive commitment. Language and linguistic organizations should reflect general cognitive principles. Principles of linguistic structure should reflect what is known about human cognition from other disciplines. Accordingly, cognitive linguistics rejects the modular theory of mind. So, modular theory of mind. The human mind is organized into distinct encapsulated modules of knowledge. One of these is the language module. Linguistic structure and organizations are marked distinct from other aspects of cognition. So the generalization commitment, identify common structural principles that hold across phonology, semantics, pragmatics, morphology, syntax, and other aspects of language. Language is not divided into separate modules. So the module theory of language is divided into distinct subsystems of modules, phonology module, syntax module, semantics module. These modules are organized in significantly divergent ways of the basis of different kinds of primitives. The functional commitment, the usage-based thesis, language structures emerge from language use. Language use is integral to our knowledge of language and mental grammar. The distinction between competence and performance is rejected. So competence and performance, competence, knowledge of language, performance is use of language. Competence determines performance. Performance does not influence competence. Performance can be affected by language, external factors. Cognitive commitment and its implications for linguistic theory. Principles of a linguistic structure should reflect what is known about human cognition from other disciplines. Central aspects of this knowledge about human cognition is represented by the 6 basic psychological terms of entrenchment, and abstraction, comparison, composition, association, and embodiment. So entrenchment, then here you have the Norwegian version. So entrenchment, the occurrence of psychological events leaves some kind of trace that facilitates their reoccurrence. Through repetition, even a highly complex event can coalesce with a well-rehearsed routine that is easily elicited and reliably executed. Equals routinization, automation, and habit formation. The entrenchment unit, when a complex structure comes to be manipulated as a prepackaged assembly, no longer requiring conscious attention to its parts or their arrangements, it has the status of unit. Similar to the idea of chunking that I spoke about when speed reading. Abstraction, the emergence of structures through reinforcement of the commonality inherent in multiple experiences, but its very nature, the abstracted process filters out those facets of individual experience which do not recur. So schematization, type of abstraction. Schematization, a specific case of abstraction, involves our capacity to operate at varying levels of granularity or resolution. Visual example. Okay, so abstractions, schema and instance. A schema is an abstract or coarse-grained representations vis-a-vis its more fully specified instances. The instances elaborate the schema in contrasting ways. A solid arrow represents the relationship between a schema and an instance. A arrow B means B elaborates A. So here are some examples. Comparison. Fundamental to the cognition is the ability to compare two structures and detect any discrepancy between them. Comparison involves an inherent asymmetry. One structure functions as a standard of comparison, the other as its target. Categorization is a special case of comparison. The standard represents an established unit, and the target, at least originally, is novel. When there's no discrepancy between standard and target, there is an instantiation relationship between them. A implies B. When there is a discrepancy between them, there is an extension relationship between them. We have instantiation to extension. So categorization, like face recognition. Composition, the combination of simpler structures to yield a more complex structure. It involves the integration of two or more component structures to form a composite structure. The Buddhist monk riddle, going up and down the hill. Association, the well-known phenomenon in which one kind of experience is able to evoke another, like the smell of bananas. Association, the particular kind of association that concerns us as symbolization, the association of conceptualization with the mental representation of observable entities such as sounds, gestures, and written marks. You have the symbolic unit, an established symbolic relationship. A symbolic unit is conveniently given as where an upper and lower case stand respectively for a conceptualization of a symbolizing structure. The slash stands for the symbolization relationship. You got bipolar. A symbolic structure is bipolar. Conceptualization is the semantic pole. The symbolization structure is the phonological pole. Then they have embodiment. The experience is embodied. We have a species-specific view of the world due to the unique nature of our physical bodies. In other words, our construal of reality is likely to be mediated in large measure by the nature of our bodies. The human mind, and therefore human, cannot be investigated in isolation from human embodiment. You have Descartes, mind-body dualism. You get the rationalist approach, modern linguistics, largely rational, generative grammar, image schemas. One way which embodied experience manifests itself at the cognitive level is in terms of image schemas, a recurring dynamic pattern of our perceptual interactions and motor programs that gives coherence to our experience. Human bodily movement and manipulation of objects, perceptual interactions involve recurring patterns without which our experience would be chaotic and incomprehensible. Call these patterns image schemas because they function primarily as abstract structures of images. So the word image is equivalent to the use of this term in psychology, where imagistic experience relates to and derives from our experience of the external world. Another term for this type of experience is sensory experience. In schema, the term schema tells us the image schemas are not rich or detailed concepts, but rather abstract concepts consisting of patterns emerging from repeating instances of embodied experience. Okay, so that's a pretty good review. Thanks for being here. Losing people, I guess it's hard to get through, but yes, I'm largely doing this research for myself, just public research session. And yeah, I'm enjoying it. I'm learning a lot. I hope it's useful to other people. So those are some of the PowerPoints I wanted to do. I'm going to read an article on linguistics, and then maybe I'll do some more PowerPoints depending on how much energy I have. So, pounding through. You can see, thanks for being here, Tom. Thanks for giving me another try, John. And, there's a lot to us. If you've been following from the beginning, I think you can see we're rounding the corner. This book I posted the other day, the 700-page book on neuroconsciousness. I've been reading it. I bought a few books on the subject. I'm reading some of these articles on the side. I'm reading some of these articles online. If the part of the precipice for me doing this was my thing on speed reading, and I looked at speed reading, and then because I had always been a speed reader, and I'd never considered the neurological implications about what's going on in my thought process. And I'd explained speed reading to many different people. using maybe meditation experience with like subvocalization and my debate with JF, you really gave me incentive to kind of rework this research. So I'm spending quite a bit of time, tens of hours, really, like, an out time, for every hour I'm on this, I probably spend 2 hours preparing, going, re-listening to it later. And so, it's a pretty good overview of consciousness and the biological, physical sciences, esoteric stuff, philosophy, to really get these principles ingrained. So if someone has interest in the subject, I'm glad I could be used to them. I don't think most universities have a consciousness studies department. Like to put together that, I took linguistics, I took some psychology, I took biology, anatomy, physics. They had like a neuropsychology in different departments, related classes, maybe philosophy of mind in the philosophy department, theology of studying Talmud, and all this other stuff. But I don't think there's one grounded version where all the studies are put together. So you see my it's kind of a mess what I'm doing here, and I apologize for that. But hopefully I'm getting it clear in my mind. If some of you are going through this stuff, if it's not reviewed to you and some of the first time you're seeing this stuff, at least you'll have some frame for where you're going to acquire this information. Linguistics is an extremely complicated subject. Almost all major universities have this. Most universities that have research universities will have maybe hundreds of people doing PhD, master's research projects that will fit into this framework. And I've been reading some studies that go over other studies. So let's stay on this topic of linguistics. I'm going to put it back into screen share mode, and I'm going to read this article in Linguistics comparing these two main systems of Chomsky's universal grammar, and we'll call it Halliday's systematic functional linguistics, which is basically like nature versus nurture. Is there a pre-coding in the brain that helps us learn language, or is language completely learned through regular learning experiences? So got Azad University. Let me quickly check where that is. I read through this already twice, so skimmed through it. Azad University is in Iran. So you got Iranian students of Chomsky, of linguistics. Chomsky's universal grammar and Halliday's systematic functional linguistics and appraisal and compromise. Recent developments in theories of language grammar seem to share a number of tenets which mark a drastic shift from traditional disentanglement descriptions of language, emphasis on a big number of discrete grammatical rules or corpus of structure or patterns has given way to more unitary, explanatory, powerful descriptions of language informed by a sound theory of language acquisition, on the one hand, and verified, refuted by observations on samples of language. On the other, two widely welcomed such theories are Chomsky's universal grammar and Halliday's systematic functional linguistics. These two theories have been initiated and developed almost independently, and each has been successful in accounting for aspects of language for a particular perspective. However, they seem to stand more in complementary position with respect to each other than in confronting stance against one another. This article aims at providing evidence for such claim to support the argument that not only aren't these two theories mutually exclusive, but they are rather mutually dependent. There is a sense in which each needs to internalize and incorporate aspects of the others if a fully fledged account of language is to be achieved. So you kind of have like top down and top up, where Chomsky's universal grammar is top down, and Halliday's systematic functional linguistics is bottom up. So introduction: since its birth in the early 20th century, linguistics has witnessed a big number of changes in its trends, orientations, subjects of study, and hence theories of language and language acquisition. Apart from the influential reorientation from the historical and diachronic linguistics towards a synchronic linguistics, which marked the beginning of modern linguistics, the most salient demarcation line between the current theories of grammar can be sketched by way of reference to Saussure's consideration of systematic versus paradigmatic relation among linguistic items. Linguistic items are said to be systematically related when viewed as a linear sequence and paradigmatically related when viewed as potential substitutes for their similarly positioned counterparts within the given sequence. Grammars that then could be viewed as seeing the language as knowledge of either primarily systematic relations among linguistic constituents or predominantly paradigmatic relations among linguistic terms. The former has led to grammars such as Markov's finite state grammar, structural descriptive linguistics, and Chomsky's generative transformation grammar, now universal grammar. And the latter has given rise to Firth's London School of Linguistics, Jacobson's Prague School of Linguistics, and Halliday's systematic functional linguistics. These two theories of those just mentioned have attracted most attention and have been frequently addressed and employed in literature on both linguistics and applied linguistics. They're Chomsky's universal grammar and Halliday's systematic functional linguistics. These two theories have been initiated and developed almost independently, and each has been successful in accounting for aspects of language from a particular perspective. However, they seem to stand more in a complementary position with respect to each other than in a confronting stance against one another. Following lines bear an account of these two theories of language, their merits and their inadequacies, and the ways in which each would contribute to the completion of the other. Chomsky's universal grammar. In Chomskyan tradition, grammar of a language is an account of the grammatical competence rather than performance of the native speakers of that language. Grammatical competence is defined as the native speaker's tacit knowledge of the grammar of the language. Native speakers' grammatical competence is determined by eliciting their intuitions about grammaticality of sentence generated in their own language, known as grammatical judgments, and about the interpretation of sentence, realizing ambiguous or paraphrased forms. A grammar is said to be descriptively adequate if it yields the same statement about the ungrammaticality and interpretations of the sentences of the native speakers of that language do. A universal grammar, however, is not an account of the grammar of individual language. It is more precisely a theory of grammar, a set of hypotheses about the nature of possible and impossible grammars in natural human languages. It follows that any grammar could be descriptively adequate if and only if it describes the properties of the intended language in accordance with and from among those universal properties already predicted and devised within the universal theory of grammar. This gives rise to one further criterion, that of universality. The second criterion, adequacy for grammars, is that of explanatory adequacy. A theory of universal grammar is said to be explanatory adequate if it could successfully explain why it contains the properties it does. In addition to all these criteria, there are still three more conditions to be satisfied by a theory of universal grammar. One, that any theory of universal grammar must be restrictive in nature. That is, the descriptive power of UG must not be so unlimited that its descriptive devices could describe as well the artificial languages, computer and mathematical languages, or other human and non-human communication systems. One more criteria of adequacy that a theory of language must meet is the learnability principle, which assumes that a linguistic theory is adequate if and only if the grammar it generates could be easily learned by children in a relatively short period of time, just as they normally do in their early childhood. In other words, the grammar must be simple as possible. These have led to new movement within UG beginning in the 1990s by Chomsky himself, which aims at minimizing the theoretical and descriptive devices in devising grammatical properties in natural languages in favor of maximizing the simplicity and hence learnability of the grammar. This movement is known as minimalism. Closely associated with the theory of universal grammars, the problem is explicating the acquisition of grammar known as the logical problem. It addresses the important question of how children acquire the grammar of their language. The initial stage so rapidly and uniformly in a remarkably short period of time at around the age of 18 months up to 30 months. Second problem, known as the developmental problem, concerns the ways in which children go through other stages, transition and final stage of learning. Chomsky's explanations for such phenomena is that children are genetically predisposed with innate language faculty, which facilitates the acquisition of language. This innate language faculty is what Chomsky conceives of as universal grammar, which comprises a set of implicit abstract principles that govern the grammatical operations allowed and not allowed in all natural languages. Examples of such principles are structural dependence principles, which holds that all grammatical operations are structure dependent, sensitive to grammatical structures of the sentences they apply to. To account for the observed differences across language and the grammatical structure, universal grammar has incorporated into its structure a number of language-specific variations, which children have to learn as part of the task of acquiring their native language. Thus, language acquisition involves not only lexical learning, but also structural learning. These grammatical variations are referred to as parameters. It follows that while some aspects of the grammatical structure of language are determined by innate grammatical principles, which will not have to be learned by children, some others have to be acquired as a parametric variation across languages. In other words, structural learning will be limited to parameterized aspects of language. Examples of parameters include the null subject parameter, according to which some languages like Italian, Spanish, Irish, Chinese are null subject. Their finite verbs license either overt or covert null subjects, while others are non-null subject languages, French, English. This is that in infinite verbs in such language licenses only overt subjects, not null subjects. One important point to consider is that there are genetic constraints on the range of structural parametric variation allowed in different languages, so that in principle all parametric variations appear to oscillate along along a binary choice with only two possible settings, and that any language allows for only one uniform possibility and not a combination of both. No single language with some form set to one value and others set to the other. The word order is another important aspect of grammatical structure, which is parameterized along various constructions. One such construction makes up the WH parameter, which determines whether WH expressions can be fronted or not. Another type of word order variation is called the head position parameter, which states that languages vary in terms of the relative position of heads with respect to their complements within phrases. While English is head first language, Japanese is head last language. In light of the above, one can generalize that only structural learning which children face as acquiring their native language is the task of determining the appropriate value for each of the relevant structural parameters along which languages vary. Now we're going to look at Halliday's systematic functional linguistics. Systemic functional grammar, or linguistics, first introduced by Michael Halliday in 1985, refers to a new approach to the study of grammar that is radically different from the traditional view in which language is a set of rules for specifying grammatical structures. In this view, language is a resource for making meanings, and hence grammar is a resource for creating meaning by means of wording. 1999, Halliday and Matheson clarified their position with respect to systemic functional linguistics as follows. For the task of constructing such a meaning base, we shall use a systemic grammar. A systemic grammar is one of the class of functional grammars, which means, among other things, that it's semantically motivated or natural, in contradiction to formal grammars, which are autonomous and therefore semantically arbitrary. In a systemic grammar, every category, and category here is used in the general sense of an organizing theoretical concept, not in the narrow sense of a class, as in formal grammar, is based on meaning. It has a semantic as well as formal lexicogrammatical reactance. To capture the essence of the distinction between grammar and theories of grammar, Halliday and Matheson call the latter grammatics. They further underscore the need for a richer theory of grammar, claiming that the traditional grammar as a rule type of theory falls short of the demands that are now made on grammatical theories. At this stage in history, we need a richer theory of grammar to meet the challenges of the age of information, education, and computation. Unlike the grammar as a rule type of theory, systemic functional linguistics takes the resource perspective rather than the rule perspective and is designed to display the overall system of grammar rather than only fragments. This is why it has come to be known as systemic functional grammar. In Halliday's terms, theory behind the present account is known as systemic theory. Systemic theory is a theory of meaning as choice, by which a language or any other semiotic system is interpreted as a network of interlocking options. Whatever is chosen in one system becomes the way into a set of choices in another, and go on as far as we need to, or as far as we can in the time available, or as far as we know how. In systemic functional linguistics, clause rather than sentence is the unit of analysis. In systemic theory, a clause is a unit in which the meaning of three different kinds are combined. three distinct structures, each expressing one kind of semantic organization, are mapped onto one another to produce a single wording. These semantic structures are referred to as metafunctions. Interesting for people who are following the speed reading, the relationship to chunking. So let's look at these metafunctions. 1, the interpersonal metafunction, concerned with the interaction between speaker and addressee, grammatical resources for enacting social roles in general, and speech roles in particular in dialogue interaction, establishing, changing, maintaining interpersonal relations. The building block of this semantic function configured as subject, finite, predicator, and complement. Number 2, the ideation metafunction. It's concerned with the ideation, grammatical resource for construing our experience in the world around and inside us. The metafunction is analyzed in terms of transitivity system, an object between 6 processes and a participant in the circumstances associated with those processes. A clause in the ideation function is a means of representing patterns of experience to build a mental picture of reality. This is what people employ to make sense of their experience of what goes on around them and inside them. These goings-on processes are sorted out in the semantic system of the language and expressed through the grammar of the clause, the system that works out the types of process and hence participants in the process and circumstances associated with the process is known as transitivity systems. In English, the processes are of the following types. Your material process of the process of doing, construes doing and happenings, including actions, activities, and events. A material clause is characterized by particular structural configurations such as process, actor, goal, recipient. In process range, there is always an actor, which can be realized by a nominal group or even a non-finite class. Further options determine whether the process is directed, in which case there is a goal as well. So if the process is directed, it may be benefactive, and if it's not, there may be a recipient. Mental process construes sensing, perception, cognition, intention, and emotion. Configurations of a process of consciousness involves a participant endowed with consciousness and typically a participant entering into or created by the consciousness configured as process, sensor, phenomenon. There is always a sensor, which is realized by a nominal group denoting a being endowed with consciousness, inasmuch more constrained that the actor and in fact the most constrained of all the participants in any of the process types. Your relation process serves to characterize and to identify if material process is concerned with our experience of the material world and mental process is concerned with our experience of the world of our own consciousness. Both of this outer experience and this inner experience may be construed by relational processes, but they model the experience of being or having rather than doing or sensing. They're concerned with the relationship set up between two things or concepts. In the attributive mode, so relational processes are expressed in two modes, attributive and identifying. In the attributive mode, an attribute is ascribed to some entity, a carrier, while the identifying mode, one entity, identifier, is used to identify another, the identified. Behavioral processes are processes of physiological and psychological behavior like smiling, coughing, laughing, breathing. They usually have one participant only, the behavior. They are immediate between material and mental processes in that the behavior is typically a conscious being, like the sensor, but the process function more like ones of doing. Verbal processes, the process of saying of any kind. It covers any kind of symbolic exchange of meaning. In Halliday's terms, like the notice tells you to keep quiet on my watch says it's 10:30. The verbalization, the message itself is termed verbiage, and the participant associated with it are sayer, the one who gives out the message, and receiver, the one to whom the message is addressed. Existence processes show that something exists or happens. The word there is frequently used in such clauses, but it has no identified function or meaning. It is merely a subject filler. The typical verb used in these clauses are be, exist, arise, and other verbs expressing existence. The nominal group that follows these verbs is called existent. For example, there was no choice. No choice is the existent, and was is the existential process. And then you have the textual metafunction, concerned with the creation of text with the presentation of ideation and interpersonal meanings as information that can be shared by speaker and listener in text, unfolding in context. This metafunction consists of two subfunctions, theme and rhyme. But what about it? Universal grammar or systemic functional grammar? While these two theories, as mentioned above, are different in their orientations toward the description of language, systagmic or opposed paradigmic, neither has denied the significant or insight from the other. They have, however, left them to be pursued further within other disciplines. It is not to deny the entrance or performance as a field of study, but merely to assert that performance is merely properly studied within the different, though related discipline of psycholinguistics, which studies the psychological process underlying speech production comprehension. Halliday similarly regards the social semiotic perspective towards the description of language as one among a number of other possible perspectives. When we consider what realities there are to lie above and beyond language, which language serves to express, there are many directions in which we can move outside language in order to explain what language means. For some linguists, the preferred mode of interpretation is the psychological one, in which language is to be explained in terms of a process of the human mind or human brain. For other linguists, perhaps the direction might be a psychoanalytic one, or an aesthetic one, or any one of a number of possible perspectives. For us, then, the perspective primarily adopted, not to the exclusion of others, but this is where we look first to seek our explanations for linguistics phenomenon, the social one. We attempt to relate language primary to one particular aspect of human experience, namely that of social structure. Attempts have been made here to show that they feed on insights from one another, and a fully fledged theory of language is to be achieved. We will therefore try to pinpoint a number of inadequacies associated with each theory, and then to compensate for them, making use of the adequacies evident in each. Then he goes on to show the weak points of SFG, and then the weak points of universal grammar, placements, universal grammar, problems with transitivity, lexicogrammatical metaphors, quoting a lot of studies. So I encourage people to try to read this all through. But I wanted more the introduction, the backdrop to these two fields. For the conclusion, it goes without saying that if universal grammar or a systemic functional grammar is armed with the potential of its counterpart theory in the form of a compromise or a two-tier model, there will be a much stronger theory of language which will meet most, if not all, of the criteria to be met by an adequate grammar of language. While Chomsky's grammar supersedes Halliday in some respects, such as the explication of cliticized forms and displacements, it seems to lag behind when it comes to discrete semantic variation among transitive systems and metaphorical modes of expressions, to the effect that a compromise between the two, and in particular between the systemic and paradigmic perspectives associated with each, seems to be inarguably inevitable. With respect to the future course of action, while it might be tempting and at the same time safer to ascribe one theory to the task of first language acquisition and the other to the development of that language in a social context, it could be argued that in light of the above evidence, universal principles could be extended to include, as well as syntactic universalities, a set of semantically related principles along the three interrelated meanings of function, and similarly parametric variations could include as well variations as a result of the presence or absence of particular semantic concepts within any language. The only catch about the latter is that they're not going to be of binary value. Okay, glad I read that paper. A lot of information there. I'm going to read another paper. We had talked yesterday about levels of consciousness and the index, and we read the paper that was critiquing this method of levels of consciousness. And so this is a paper that proposes this theory of levels of consciousness, the different ways of looking at consciousness in general. People saw that yesterday. Okay, theoretical based index of consciousness independent of sensory processing and behavior. One challenging aspect of the clinical assessment of brain injured, unresponsive patients is the lack of an objective measure of consciousness that is independent of the subject's ability to interact with the external environment. Theoretical considerations suggest that consciousness depends on the brain's ability to support complex activity patterns that are at once distributed among interacting cortical areas, integrated and differentiated in space and time. We introduce and test a theory-driven index of the level of consciousness called the Perturbational Complexity Index. PCI is calculated by perturbing the cortex with transcranial magnetic stimulants to engage distributed interactions in the brain and compressing the spatial temporal pattern of these electrocortical responses to measure their algorithm complexity. We test PCI on a large data set of TMS-evoked potentials recorded in healthy subjects during wakefulness, dreaming, non-rapid eye movement, sleep, and at levels of sedation induced by anesthetic agents, as well as patients who have emerged from a coma, vegetative state, minimally conscious state, and locked-in syndrome. PCI reliably discriminated the level of consciousness in single individuals during wakefulness, sleep, and anesthesia, as well as patients who had emerged from coma and recovered minimal level of consciousness. PCI can potentially be used for an objective determination of the level of consciousness at the bedside. So here's a pretty medical determination for consciousness. Fundamental shortcoming of clinical practice is the lack of reliable method to objectively assess the level of consciousness. Currently, the clinical evaluation of consciousness relies on the patient's ability to interact with surrounding environmental and to demonstrate his or her subjective experience. Under some conditions, however, such as during surgical anesthesia or after severe brain injury, patients may be conscious but disconnected from the external environment because their sensory, motor, or executive functions are impaired. Under these circumstances, an individual's level of consciousness cannot be assessed. Here we develop an index that aims to overcome this problem. Phenomenologically, each conscious experience is both differentiated and integrated. Neurophysiologically, these fundamental properties of subjective experience rely on the ability of multiple functional specialized areas of thalamocortical systems to interact rapidly and effectively form an integrated whole. Hence, the emerging idea in theoretical neuroscience is that consciousness requires an optimal balance between functional integration and functional differentiation in thalamocortical networks, otherwise defined as brain complexity. This complexity should be high when consciousness is present and low when consciousness is lost in sleep, anesthesia, or coma. Theoretical indexes based on the principle have been designed to assess this joint presence of differentiation and integration in neural systems. These metrics are only applicable, however, to simple systems of stimulated elements or under highly restrictive assumptions and have not been tested on human brains. Currently used empirical indices of consciousness instead are based either on integration alone, as judged by the extent of synchronization of cortical activation, or on differentiation alone, as judged by entropy or spectral content, and do not reliably assess consciousness in individual patients and across many different conditions. In a recent series of experiments, we assessed the EEG response to transcranial magnetic stimulation during physiological, pharmacological, and pathological loss of consciousness. We found that compared to responsive consciousness, wakeful individuals' brain responses of people who had lost consciousness became either local, suggesting a loss of integration, or global but stereotypical, suggesting a loss of differentiation. Nevertheless, these studies did not allow us to quantify brain complexity across subjects and conditions, a requirement for a reliable, unified measurement skill. Here we introduce an empirical measure of brain activity, complexity, the Perturbational Complexity Index, which gauges the amount of information contained in the integrated response in the thalamocortical system to a direct perturbation. We test PCI on a large data set of TMS-evoked potentials recorded from healthy subjects during wakefulness, dreaming, non-rapid eye movement, sleep, and different levels of sedation influenced by different anesthetic agents, as well as from brain-injured patients who had emerged from coma. So results. We determined the PCI in individual patients by performing several steps, recording the brain's early reaction within the first 0.3 seconds to determine a TMS-induced cortical perturbation with high-density EEG, performing source modeling and non-parametric statistics to extract a binary matrix of significant sources that describe the spatial temporal pattern of activation caused by the TMS perturbation, and compressing this matrix to calculate its information content with algorithmic complexity measures such as the Lempel-Ziv complexity index, and normalizing algorithmic complexity by the source entropy. Thus, operationally, PCI is defined as the normalized Lempel-Ziv complexity of the spatial temporal pattern of cortical activation triggered by direct TMS perturbation. In practice, PCI is expected to be low if there is reduced interaction among cortical areas, because in this case, the matrix of activation engaged in TMS will be spatially restricted. PCI will also be low if many interacting areas all react to the perturbation in a stereotypical way, because the resulting matrix will be large but redundant and can be effectively compressed. PCI will be high only when initial perturbation is transmitted to a large set of integrated areas that react differently, giving rise to a spatial temporal pattern of activation that cannot easily be reduced. So I'm going to skip through, encourage people to read this whole article. We see PCI is sensitive to graded changes in the level of consciousness. And you go over the study, the measurements, and what they did. So here we have developed and tested a theoretical-based measure of consciousness, PCI. Empirically, PCI provides a data-driven metric that can discriminate level of consciousness in single subjects under different conditions: wakefulness, dreaming, the LAS, MCS, EMCS, immediate levels of sedation, non-REM sleep, midazolam, Xelam, and propofol-induced loss of consciousness, and the vegetated unresponsive wakefulness state. Various brain-based empirical measures have been proposed as potentially neurophysiological markers of level of consciousness. These metrics belong to one of two general categories. The first embraces methods that aim to quantify the information or spectral content of brain signals, such as the approximate entropy, the spectral entropy, and the bispectral index. The second category includes methods that evaluate the spatial extent or synchronization of brain activations, such as late event-related potentials, measured of effective connectivity derived from dynamic causal modeling analysis, or from TMS, EEG data, and Granger causality and coherence analysis of electrophysiological and metabolic time series. Although each of these metrics tends to show group-level differences between specific conditions in which consciousness is absence or presence, they are less reliable when it comes to detecting reproducible and graded changes in single individuals under different conditions. For example, the biospectric index is widely variable among subjects and anesthetic agents and cannot reliably discriminate between conscious and unconscious brain-injured individuals. Similarly, late event-related potentials such as mismatch negativity can be absent in conscious subjects and present in unconscious subjects. On the other hand, the TMS EEG measure of effective connectivity may discriminate between individual patients, but are qualitative and sensitive to graded changes in the level of consciousness, whereas coherence and Granger causality can actually be increased during loss of consciousness induced by propofol anesthesia. The index described here, PCI, gauges at once both the information content and integration of the overall output of the cortiothalamic system by measuring the algorithmic complexity of the brain's response to a perturbation. Unlike other measures of complexity that are applied to spontaneous brain signals, PCI only assesses information that is generated through deterministic interactions within the thalamocortical system. In this way, the resulting measured complexity is minimally affected by random processes such as noise and muscle activity, or by patterns that are not genuinely integrated, such as those generated by isolated neuronal sources or common drivers. On the other hand, PCI is distinct measures of integration that rely on the spread of synchronization of neural activation, because this is low when neural activity is spatially extended but undifferentiated and stereotypical. This aspect is relevant because hyposynchronous and widespread cortical activations can be observed when consciousness is lost during anesthesia, NREM sleep, and generalized seizures. As long as the initial perturbation triggered a significant response, PCI was reproducible within and across subjects and varied within the level of consciousness in graded fashion. PCI behaved in the same way whether loss of consciousness was caused by a physiological process like sleep or by pharmacological intervention with anesthetic agents, with different mechanisms of action, suggesting their index captures a neural correlate of level of consciousness that is general and reliable. Notable, the rate with the PCI increased was reproducible within and across subjects and changed only one level of consciousness was altered. Although immediately after TMS stimulation, PCI increased with similar rates in all consciousness states, values during wakefulness started to diverge from values during loss of consciousness about 100 milliseconds after stimulation. These latencies are consistent with the time scale required to develop a conscious sensory experience and with the time required to build up distributed causal interactions in thalamocortical networks through feed-forward and reentrant connections. Many patients emerge from coma and exhibit signs of intermediate level of consciousness ranging from simple visual fixation to a confused state in subjects with severe cognitive disability. Assessing consciousness in these patients can be particularly difficult because clinical signs are often fluctuating, unreliable, and may be confounded by reflexive motor activity. Calculating PCI allowed comparison in the same coordinate space of individual brain-injured patients who emerge from the coma and healthy subjects during conscious wakefulness and loss of consciousness. In patients with a stable clinical diagnosis, PCI was as low as in healthy sleeping and anesthetized subjects, despite preserved levels of behavioral arousal. Conversely, PCI was high as in healthy awake subjects. In 2 brain-injured patients with LAS, notable PCI in patients with MCS and MCS tended to be lower than observed in healthy awake subjects, but also above the highest value found in conditions in which consciousness was unambiguously lost. Thus, PCI differs from TMS EEG measures of effective connectivity, which are unable to detect graded changes in the level of consciousness. On the other hand, the fact that PCI in MCS and EMCS and LAS patients was invariable above maximum value detected during loss of consciousness distinguishes PCI from measures of brain activation to sensory or verbal simulation, which are characterized by a significant rate of false negatives in brain-injured patients. From a practical standpoint, PCI may permit the comparison of different subjects and different conditions within the same coordinate space. Most importantly, it can establish a reliable measurement scale by defining a range of values for various conditions in which non-consciousness is present and absent. This is a key requirement for validation of neurophysiological marker that may then be applicable to single individuals whose conscious level is unknown, such as those with complete LAS, ambiguous non-communicating brain injured, or end-stage demented patients, catatonic psychiatric patients, and paralyzed subjects who are at risk of regaining awareness during surgical anesthesia. Although our studies suggest that a high PCA value in a subject who is otherwise totally unable to interact with the external environment indicates that he or she is conscious, this conclusion is subject to limitations. One is the relative small number of brain-injured patients that we have used for testing PCI. Further studies are needed to demonstrate that an independent larger sample of patients who are clinically MCS, the PCI values are invariably distinguishable from those obtained from unconscious subjects. It will be equally important to verify in an independent sample that PCI values are high in subjects who are behaviorally unresponsive and conscious. Thus, PCI should be further tested in dissociated states, such as during dreaming and ketamine anesthesia, when subjects are conscious but temporarily disconnected from external environment. PCI should also be validated in selected patients who are clinically VS but show consistent neural responses to verbal instructions. An important caveat is that although PCI does not depend on the cortical site of stimulation in healthy brains, it may be inaccurate in brain-injured patients when the TMS perturbation is applied to a structurally damaged portion of the cortical surface. PCI can be reliably calculated only if the TMS stimulation effectively elicits a significant cortical response. This process can be avoided by using an image-guided TMS positioning system to avoid targeted damaged cortical sites. Here we have reported PCI, potentially useful index of consciousness, that evaluates the compressibility of the brain response to TMS, a perturbation that directly engages large portions of the thalamocortical system without requiring the subject to perform any sensory, motor, or cognitive task. In this way, the capacity for consciousness can be assessed on the basis of the complexity of cortical interactions, independent of the subject's capacity or willingness to react to external stimuli commands. PCI is calculated from principles derived from theoretical neuroscience, and its apparent usefulness supports the notion that consciousness is linked to complexity, measured as the information content of distributed causal interactions in the brain. And the article continues with more parts of the study. Encourage people to read that if they have a chance. And I think I'm going to read one more article. So you just want to get this done. Going through. Shalom, Dave. Appreciate you coming. I'm just reading through these articles. If the brain science is of interest to you, and hope it's of interest to people and people will be gaining from it. But to some extent, I'm doing it just for myself to advance my own research. Okay, so we got active interoceptive inference in the emotional brain. This is Anil Seth, who we've seen quite a few times. I watched some of his lectures yesterday on YouTube. And we see there's all types of journals that are constantly publishing studies on this. So, I mean, you could read thousands, maybe tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of articles and studies on this topic, on these topics. So active interoceptive inference in the emotional brain. We review a recent shift in, this is from 2016. We review a recent shift in conception of interoception and its relationship to hierarchical inference in the brain. The notion of interoceptive inference means that bodily states are regulated by autonomic reflexes that are enslaved by descending predictions from deep generative models of our internal and external milieu. This reconceptualization illuminates several issues in cognitive and clinical neuroscience with implications for experiences of selfhood and emotion. We first contextualize interoception in terms of active Bayesian interference in the brain, highlighting its inactivist embodied aspects. We then consider the key role of uncertainty or precision and how this might translate into neuromodulation. We next examine the implications for understanding the functional anatomy of the emotional brain, surveying recent observations on adrenal cortex. Finally, we turn to the theoretical issue, namely the role of interoception in shaping senses of embodied self and feelings. We will draw links between physiological homeostasis and allostasis, early cybernetic ideas of predictive control in hierarchical generative models in predictive processing. The explanatory scope of interoceptive inference ranges from explanations for autism and depression through to consciousness. We offer a brief survey of those exciting developments. Recent years have seen the emergence of a framework within cognitive neuroscience that offers exactly the right set of concepts to talk about the body and mind in terms of beliefs about the body. On this view, the brain is not an elaborate stimulus-response link, but a statistical organ that actively generates explanations for the stimuli it encounters. In terms of hypotheses that are tested against sensory evidence, this perspective can be traced back to Helmholtzian formulations of unconscious inference. Over the last few years, the underlying idea has been formalized to cover deeper hierarchical Bayesian inference about the hidden causes of our sensations and how these inferences induce beliefs and behavior. Explanations, hypotheses, and beliefs should in this context be understood not as consciously held mental states, but as neuronically encoded probability distributions over the hidden causes of sensory signals. The biophysical encoding of these beliefs is technically in terms of sufficient statistics like a mean or expectation of a distribution. In the last few years, Bayesian brain ideas have been applied to the context of interoception. which refers to the perception and integration of autonomic, hormonal, visceral, and immunological signals, or most informally as the sense of the body from within, or some of these views, emotional experience and experiences of embodied selfhood emerge from top-down inference of the multimodal causes of interoceptive afference, generalizing so-called two-factor or evaluative theories of motion and cognition. A first implication of these proposals is that these kinds of perceptual experience are subject to implicit and perhaps idiosyncratic beliefs as the perception of the external world. Beyond this, the context of interoception brings about further shifts in how to think about the relationship between body, mind, and brain. One such shift is the generative models of interoceptive signals should be geared towards control or regulation of physiological variables rather than towards accurate representations of some extracranial state of affairs. The two goals remain tightly interwoven in so much as effective regulation depends on deployment of sufficiently elaborated predictive models. This shift recognizes alternative origins to Bayesian brain ideas in the 20th century cybernetics, and doing so points to a deep connection between life and mind, in which cognitive processes are grounded in fundamentally evolutionary imperatives to maintain physiological homeostasis. Many other specific implications flow, for example, in reframing the functional basis of a variety of disorders of emotion and selfhood. Here we survey these exciting developments. We first provide a brief introduction to the framework of prediction error minimization in the Bayesian brain, emphasizing its embodiment or inactive aspects. These aspects appear predominantly in the role of action in reducing prediction error and emphasize the key role of uncertainty or precision in shaping the interplay between prior beliefs and sensory evidence. Precision weighting of recurrent signaling in cortical hierarchies is closely associated with neuromodulation, providing important clues about developmental origins of conditions like autism. It is also associated with attention, suggesting novel accounts for symptom expressions due to aberrant attention interoceptive signals. Turning to functional neuroanatomy, we outline the functional architecture of interoceptive inference and receive recent suggestions that perceptual predictions originate preferentially in agranular cortices, while acknowledging the direct empirical evidence for interoceptive inference is still to be uncovered. We next address some theoretical issues relating to active interoceptive inference to experience of emotion and embodied selfhood, highlighting a control-oriented or instrumental perspective on interoceptive inference that calls on cybernetic concepts of predictive regulation, allostatic control, and perceptual control theory. We conclude by exploring the implications of these ideas from a sample of clinical conditions that may reflect false interoceptive reference, either in their etiology and or in symptom expressions. While disorders in emotional processing and interoceptive experience naturally invite explanations in terms of abnormal interoceptive inference, we also highlight how this perspective can illuminate other conditions and symptoms, including autism, fatigue, and depression. Predictive coding in the Bayesian brain. Current formulations of Helmholtz notion are now the most popular metaphor for neuronal processing and are usually considered under the Bayesian brain hypothesis predictive coding. Predictive coding is a process theory by biological plausible backstory and a considerable amount of empirical support. In these schemes, neuronal representations in higher and deeper levels of neuronal hierarchies generate predictions of representations in lower levels. These ascending predictions are compared with lower level representations to form a predictive error. This mismatch or difference signal is passed back up the hierarchy to update higher representations. The recurrent exchange of signals between adjacent hierarchical levels resolves prediction error at each and every level, resulting in hierarchical deep explanation for sensory inputs. In computational terms, the activation of neuronal populations is assumed to encode Bayesian beliefs or probability distributions over states of the word that cause sensation. Simplest encoding corresponds to representing the belief with the expected value, cause, or expectation. These causes are referred to as hidden because they have to be inferred from their sensory consequences. In other words, they cannot be directly observed and are forever hidden behind a sensory wall. This figure summarizes the hierarchy of neuron message passing that underlies predictive coding. Basic idea is that the neuronal activity encodes expectations about the causes of sensory input, where these expectations minimize prediction error. Prediction error is the difference between ascending sensory input and descending prediction on that input. The minimization rests upon recurrent neuronal interactions between different levels of cortical hierarchy. Current interpretation suggests that superficial pyramid cells, red triangles, compare the expectations at each level of top-down predictions from deep pyramidal cells at higher levels. On the left, the schematic shows a simple cortical hierarchy with ascending prediction errors and descending predictions. This graphic includes neuromodularity, gaining control of superficial pyramidal cells that determine their relative influence on the deep pyramidal cells, encoding expectations through modulation of expected precision. On the right, this provides a schematic example of the visual system. It shows the putative cells of origin of ascending and forward connections that convey prediction errors and descending or backward connections that construct predictions. These prediction errors are weighted by their expected precision that we have associated with the activity of neuromodularity systems. Here, projections from ventral tegmental area are substantia nigra. In this example, the frontal, okay, so let people go through. There's a lot to read. So in short, predictive coding represents a biological plausible scheme for updating beliefs about the world based on sensory samples. In this setting, neuroanatomy and neurophysiology can be regarded as a distillation of statistical or causal structure in the environment that is disclosed by sensory samples. The resulting anatomy of connections and their physiology furnish a generative model, generative prediction, or sensation that can be compared with actual sensory samples. Empirical evidence is now emerging that shows how prior expectations shape behavior in neural signatures of perception, with recent studies in vision and audition proving excellent examples. More generally, this view of perception emphasizes the beholder's share. The insight of the beholder's perception involves a top-down inference convinced Gombrich that there is no innocent eye, that is, all visual perception is based on classifying concepts, interpreting visual information. One cannot perceive that which one cannot classify. Embodied active inference and precision weighting. There are two key ways in which prediction errors can be reduced. The first is by updating predictions to make them more like expectations at lower states and sensations currently in the play. The process corresponds to perception as implemented in predictive coding. The second way to resolve prediction errors is to change the sensory samples to make them more like predictions. This entails an active sampling of the sensorium through a redeployment of sensory surfaces, saccadic eye searches, and other sensory palpitations, placing predictive coding in an embodiment of an active framework in which both action and perception are in the game of minimizing the same prediction error is known as active inference. To fully appreciate the bilateral nature of active inference, one has to consider the embodiment context in which predictions are made and fulfilled. These predictions are not only about the world, but also about the body. In brief, perception can be understood as resolving exteroceptive prediction errors by selecting predictions that best explain sensations, while behavior suppresses predictive error by changing proprioceptive sensations. The suppression rests in classical reflexes, whose equilibrium points are set by descending proprioceptive predictions. For example, an intended movement can be elicited by simply predicting the proprioceptive consequences of a particular movement trajectory, which will be fulfilled by peripheral reflexes. Note that the only proprioceptive prediction errors are minimized. However, with good generative model, these movements will also fulfill visual and other exteroceptive predictions. This follows because descending multimodal predictions emanate from a deep generative model that effectively assimilate prediction errors from all modalities, including interoception. In this context, an important and sometimes overlooked aspect of active inference is that it implies a counterfactual or conditional aspect. That is, in order for an action successfully to reduce prediction error, the brain must represent not only the hidden causes of current sensory signals, but also must use these representations to predict how sensory signals would change under specific actions. Interesting, it has been suggested that such counterfactual aspects of perception prediction may underlie basic properties of perceptual experience, such as presence or objecthood. To enable predictions about the consequences of action to be fulfilled, we have to attenuate proprioceptive prediction errors that would otherwise deliver unequivocal evidence that we are not in fact acting. The attenuation rates rest on reducing the precision of proprioceptive prediction errors. Precision can be regarded as a measure of signal of noise or confidence. Mathematically, precision is the inverse variance of reliability of a signal. Estimating precision speaks to a fundamental aspects of inference, namely the encoding of precision or expected uncertainty. In other words, we have to infer both the cause of our sensations and the context in terms of the expected or subjective precision of sensory evidence. This represents a subtle but ubiquitous problem for the brain, where the solution rests on modulating the gain or excitability of neuronal populations reporting prediction error. Heuristically, one can regard ascending prediction errors in cortical hierarchies of broadcasting newsworthy information that cannot be explained by descending predictions. However, the brain also has to select the prediction errors it attends to. It can do this by adjusting their volume or gain. These prediction errors that have been assigned high precision therefore have privileged access to the higher levels of the hierarchy and therefore update high-level expectations. Empirical evidence suggests that this precision weighting is a generic computational process throughout the brain and may be instantiated through neuromodularity mechanisms of gain control at a synaptic level. The ensuing neuromodularity gain controls corresponds to a Bayesian optimal encoding precision in terms of this excitability of neuronal populations reporting prediction errors. This may explain why superficial pyramidal cells are equipped with so many synaptic gain control mechanisms, such as NMDA receptors and classical neuromodulator receptors like D1 dopamine receptors. Furthermore, it places excitation and inhibition balances in a perfect position to mediate Bayesian belief updating within and among hierarchical laws. This contextual aspect of predictive coding has been associated with attention gain control in sensory processing and has been discussed in terms of affordance in the setting of action selection. Crucially, the delicate balance of precision over hierarchical levels can have profound effect on inference and may underlie false beliefs in psychopathology. So interoceptive inference. Key challenges for formal accounts of brain function are emotion, self-awareness, and their disorders. Recently, people have started to cast emotional processing in terms of predictive coding or inference about interoceptive or bodily states. The basic argument follows the explanation for action above, namely motor reflexes are driven by proprioceptive prediction errors. Proprioceptive prediction errors compare primary afferents from stretch receptors with proprioceptive prediction that descend to alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord and cranial nerve nuclei. This effectively replaces descending motor commands with proprioceptive prediction, which are fulfilled by peripheral reflexes. These predictions rest on deep hierarchical inference about states of the world, including our own body. Replacing proprioceptive signals with interoceptive signals, one can see how autonomic reflexes can contrive descending interoceptive predictions into physiological homeostasis. Importantly, interoceptive predictions constitute just one stream of multimodal predictions that are generated by expectations about the embodied self. Of this view, interoceptive signals do not cause emotional awareness or vice versa. Instead, there is a circular causality where neuronally encoded predictions about bodily stages engage on autonomic reflexes through active inference. While interoceptive signals inform and update these predictions, emotion or affective content then become an attribute of any representation that generates interoceptive predictions, where interoception is necessarily contextualized by concurrent exteroceptive and proprioceptive cues. Useful way to think about interoceptive inference is as generalizing psychological James Lang and two-factor appraisal approaches to emotion. These formulations regard emotional experiences arising from cognitively contextualized perception of changes in bodily state. Interoceptive inference extends these early ideas to incorporate a smooth hierarchy of precision-weighted predictions and prediction errors without assuming any bright-line distinction between cognitive and non-cognitive processing. By analogy with predictive coding approaches to visual perception, we propose that emotional content is determined by belief, posterior expectations about the causes of interoceptive signals across multiple hierarchical levels. An important challenge to this context is to identify which aspects of inference support specifically conscious emotional experience, with predictions rather than prediction errors being the preferred vehicles. It is tempting to speculate that deep expectations at higher levels of the neuronal hierarchy are candidates for or correlates of conscious experience, largely because their predictions are domains general and can therefore be articulated through autonomic or motor reflexes. Crucially, interoceptive inference arguments, appraisal theories, with the concept of active inference by which interoceptive predictions can perform physiological homeostasis by eliciting autonomic reflexes. More specifically, descending predictions provide a homeostatic set point against which primary interoceptive afferents can be compared. The resulting prediction error then drives sympathetic or parasympathetic affective systems to ensure homeostasis or allostasis. For example, sympathetic smooth muscle vacillations and reflexive response to the predictive interoceptive consequences of blushing with embarrassment. This formulation of autonomic reflexes follows exactly the active inference formulation of motor reflexes that enable the contraction of striated muscle to be prescribed or enslaved by equilibrium points set by descending projections to alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord. Active inference highlights a shift from predictive models underlying perception of hidden causes of sensory data to the use control of regulation of these causes. Importantly, both predictive perception and predictive regulation can involve action, as emphasized by distinguishing epistemic or instrumental active inference. The basic idea is that epistemic active inference involves selecting actions that we expect to increase the fit between predictive models and hidden causes of sensory signals. This forms of inference may characterize, for example, saccadic eye movements or explanatory body movements to inform self-models. Instrumental active inference, by contrast, leverages predictive models to achieve control of sensory variables. This perspective has been applied to exteroception as a guise of perceptual control theory, which emphasizes that control systems control what they sense, not what they do. Instrumental or control-oriented inference is, however, particularly relevant to interoception, where maintenance of physiological variables within homeostatically viable ranges is critical to organism survival. In this context, exploratory epistemic interoceptive actions may be less evident because they may be more costly. One does not want to raise one's blood pressure to physiological dangerous levels just to see whether it can return. Dissociative predictive models with control and sensory variables recalls the cybernetic view that every good regulator of a system must be a model of that system. And the distinction between instrumental and epistemic actions also highlights the counterfactual aspects of active inference, where potential actions are associated with their likely sensory consequences. So in terms of predictive coding, the balance between homeostatic reflexes are more goal-directed. Allostatic behaviors rest upon confidence, precision, placed in deeper expectations about how we will behave. For example, hypoglycemia could induce low-level predictions that mobilize glucose stores. Alternatively, if we can attenuate the precision of low-level interoception, the proceptive predictions can be fulfilled that produce domain-specific homeostatic responses and engage allostatic behavior, preparing and consuming a meal. And yet, direct empirical evidence for and against interoceptive prediction or prediction errors is still lacking. While there is ample circumstance that fits comfortably within this framework, principles of interoceptive inference rest primarily on the view that perceptual inference, whether about this world or about the body, is likely to involve a common computational architecture. Moreover, the neural anatomical properties of brain regions involved in interoceptive processing can be informally interpreted from this perspective, as we describe next. So, functional neuroanatomy and interoceptive inference. Translating the computational machinery of an interoceptive inference into a deeper understanding of brain function requires mapping its computational elements onto neuroanatomical substrates. A number of recent proposals suggest several convergent features. The first is the so-called visceromotor areas such as the anterior insular cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, subgenual cortex, and perhaps also the orbital frontal cortex are situated at the top of an interoceptive hierarchy. The second is that these areas collectively embody a generative model of interoceptive responses and issue predictions that, when unpacked at the lowest hierarchical level, such as homeostatic set points, these VMAs are known to receive ascending projections from visceral central areas, and their descending connections engage in a range of subcortical brainstem and spinal cord targets involved in visceral motor control, such as the perioaqueductal gray and the parabrachial nucleus. Visceral motor afferents also directly innervate visceral central areas, potentially providing a form of efference, copy, or corollary discharge, enabling the formation of ascending interoceptive prediction errors, as well as known anatomical connectivity patterns. The basic architecture is supported by cytoarchitectonic observations that VMAs lack a well-formed granular layer 4 as a target for ascending prediction errors. Such granulocortical regions are argued to be well-suited to the issue of predictions in both interoceptive and motor domains. Figure 4 shows a schematic of the sort of functional anatomy applied by interoceptive inference. Okay. So simplified neural architecture underlies the predictive coding of visual, somatosensory, and interoceptive signals. The anatomical designations, although plausible, are used to simply illustrate how predictive coding can be mapped onto neural systems. Okay, interoceptive inference and embodied selfhood. Having described the computational architecture of interoceptive inference and its potential functional neuroanatomy, we are now in position to explore how this framework can illuminate more theoretical issues in the nature and experience of selfhood. In everyday life, we experience our selfhood as continuous and integrated. While it may be adaptive to experience being a self in this way, it would be a mistake to assume on this basis that there is such a thing as a unitary self process underlying these experiences. Clinical conditions in experimental manipulations amply illustrate the experience of selfhood unfold across many partially independent and partially overlapping levels of description, levels that can be teased apart in the laboratory or which may fall apart during psychiatric or neurological illness. A simple classification from low to high levels would range from experiences of being and having a body through to the experience of perceiving the world from a particular point of view, to experiences of intention and agency, and at the higher levels, the experience of being a continuous self over time, a narrative self or I that depends on episodic autobiographical memory. And finally, a social self in which my experience of being me is shaped by how I perceive others. Perception of me in the punitive classification, interoception plays a key role in structuring experience of being and having a body. Embodied selfhood may also shape selfhood at other hierarchical higher levels. There's an accumulating evidence that interoception plays a key role in shaping experiences of body ownership. Illusions of body ownership, like the rubber hand illusion, the so-called full body illusion, while normally included in false visual tactile congruence, can also be induced by cardiovisual feedback, in which a virtual body flashes in time with a participant's heartbeat. Recent extensions of these studies have also shown that visual feedback or respiratory patterns can have a similar effect, providing support for a multimodal influence of interoception and embodied selfhood. The ways in which interoceptive predictions and predictions errors shape higher levels of selfhood remain excited areas for investigation. As discussed next, much of current evidence of these areas is found in studies of neural experience of selfhood. Okay, so I'm not going to read out loud these next sections. I encourage people to at least skim them, looking at selfhood and psychopathy. So looking at autism, perhaps the best example of applying concepts for interoceptive inference to understanding disorders of selfhood can be found in autism research. Depression and fatigue. Okay, concluding remarks. Applying the framework of active inference to interoceptive provides a powerful set of concepts which to conceive the neurofunctional basis of emotion, embodied selfhood, and allostatic control. The main points can be summarized as follows. Interoceptive inference parallels other applications of active inference or prediction area minimization in proposing that sensory areas convey ascending prediction errors that are compared with descending prediction across a hierarchy of perceptual processing. For interoceptive inference prediction issues from agranular VMAs and projective viscerosensory areas to provide corollary feedback, as well as brainstem and subcortical areas to engage automatic homostatic reflexes. Important visceromotor predictions are best interpreted as providing homostatic set points that enslave autonomic reflexes and guide allostatic responses via interoceptive prediction errors at different hierarchical levels and timescales. This perspective emphasizes the anticipatory control-oriented nature of interoceptive inference, recalling the role of predictive models in cybernetic theories of regulation, as well as the counterparts in exteroceptive perceptual control theory. Mapping the computational architecture of interoceptive inference to neuroanatomical substrates and considering the key role of precision weighing provides the tools to connect these ideas to theories of emotional embodied selfhood and their experimental manipulation, and a range of clinical conditions which express interoceptive symptoms and are plausible originate via disruptions of interoceptive inference. In terms of theoretical implications, emotions, feeling states can be seen as the joint content of interoceptive predictions, while embodied selfhood rests on the multimodal and amodal predictions that distinguish self-related from non-self signals via active inference. Accumulating clinical data and experimental evidence are revealing the mechanisms by which interoceptive signaling shapes experience of self and also perceptions of stimuli originating from external environment. However, uncovering empirical evidence that speaks directly in favor or against interoceptive inference stands an important challenge. Key predictions of the framework are that descending signals from VMAs carry predictions about the causes of interoceptive signals, and further that in doing so, they serve homeostatic set points. Sending signals target VMA convey interoceptive prediction errors, and emotional affective content depend primarily on interoceptive predictions rather than prediction errors. Further research could test these predictions using advanced laminar fMRI methods, potentially distinguish prediction from prediction error responses, or by capitalizing on natural variety in physiological rhythms to model ongoing interoceptive prediction errors that might be reflected in electrophysiological signals. Microneurography techniques, which allow direct recording of peripheral nerve traffic, might also provide an innovative means of isolating interoceptive prediction and prediction error signals. Extending active inference to include autonomic reflexes and interoceptive predictions raises many further interesting questions. For example, can the putative role of neuromodulators, dopamine, oxytocin, in mediating the precision of prediction errors help to explain the close relationship between arousal and anxiety? What is the relationship between exteroception and interoception during self-observation? And how does this depend on the attenuation of the precision of respective prediction errors? Do von Economo cells in infragranular cortical layers convey interoceptive predictions from the insular cortex, the amygdala, and to the other subcortical targets? How does the control-oriented nature of interoceptive inference shape the qualitative aspects of interoceptive experience? And what in general determines the conscious status of interoceptive predictions? Key questions about the hierarchical inferences and the role of interoception are also being addressed in the new field of neuropsychoanalysis. Practical implications of these ideas are highlighted by their application to a variety of clinical conditions in which atypical interoceptive inference may play an important role in the etiology and/or symptom expression. Emotional disorders like alexithymia are relatively straightforward to explain in terms of atypical interoception, while more complex and heterogeneous constructs like anxiety have been considered in terms of interoceptive prediction error for more than a decade. Recent developments have focused on depression and fatigue as emerging from the interoceptive experience of chronic homeostasis, whether directly or via metacognitive beliefs, inadequate allostatic self-efficacy. Autism, also highly heterogeneous, seems to have a common interoceptive foundation, possibly with a developmental origin and symptom expression characterized by discrepancies between reduced objective interoceptive sensitivity and enhanced self-appraisal of interoceptive ability. Importantly, the involvement of interoceptive inference in these and other conditions, including, for instance, depersonalization disorder, opens new avenues for diagnosis through psychological measures and computational psychiatry approaches and potential clinical interventions via interoceptive training and feedback. Altogether, consider embodied selfhood through the lens of prediction error minimalization brings a new way to look at about the old doctrine. Descartes, beside dividing the world into res cognitans and res extensa, also achieved a certain notoriety for introducing the doctrine of the beast machine. He argued that while humans had minds directing their behavior, non-human animals were nothing more than unthinking, unfeeling machines that breathe, digest, perceive, and move like clockwork. Now that we can see how human minds are deeply grounded in embodied physiology, and that similar function principles may unite physiological regulation with perception of the external world and the guidance of actions and behavior, an inversion of Descartes' doctrine seems plausible that our subjective experience of selfhood may arise because of, not in spite of, the fact that we too are beast-like machines. Awesome. Really enjoyed that one. A lot of information here. I know like I'm hemorrhaging viewership. I can understand it's hard and uninteresting to people to watch this. Whoever is watching it, I appreciate them doing that. I hope they're gaining from it. And I hope I'm putting out good content. And even if these aren't widely watched, maybe in the future there'll be reference at least to myself or a few others. And in my future endeavors, it'll be good to have went through and clarified this information to the best of my ability. So thanks again. Shalom. Blessings to everybody. And I might have 3 more of these actually looking like. So shalom.